Today, I want to talk about the absurdity of the Trinity in Christian theology. And there's honestly so much to discuss on this topic that I'll likely have to make a part two of this because the idea of a Trinity doesn't evolve in a vacuum. We can trace its conceptual evolution from ancient Egypt through contemporary Greco Roman thought and to its ultimate destination being concretized in religious superstition. It's absolutely fascinating. And if that type of breakdown interests you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And also, let me know your thoughts in the comments. So let's start with the classical Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Now, according to Nicene Christianity, God is one divine being, essence, or substance, eternally existing as three distinct persons: the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Each person is fully God, not one third of God. The persons are co eternal and co equal. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, and the Spirit is not the Father. Nevertheless, they're not three gods, but one God. This is problematic already. Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, Lutheran, Reformed, and most evangelical churches affirm this basic structure. It can be expressed as the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, but the Father is not the Son, and the Son is not the Spirit, and the Spirit is not the Father. There's only one God. The standard explanation is that God is one what, but three who's, one divine nature possessed indivisibly by three persons. The persons are traditionally distinguished by their relations of origin. The Father is unbegotten, the Son is eternally begotten by the Father, and the Holy Spirit eternally proceeds. But this leads to a very significant question. How does one classify a difference of personhood without a difference of being? A distinct person, by all accounts, would also be a distinct being. Taken in ordinary language, three persons but one being is incoherent. It survives only by changing the meanings of person, being, and is used whenever the normal meanings create a contradiction. A person is a human being, a man, woman, or a child. Under that definition, the Father is not a person. A pre incarnate divine spirit is not a person. The Holy Spirit is not a person. God is not three persons. Jesus can be called a person insofar as Christianity claims he became a human being. But that doesn't establish that an eternal son was already a person before Jesus existed as a human. And it certainly does not establish that an invisible spirit is a person. So the doctrine begins with a category mistake. It applies a human category to alleged non human divine entities. When challenged, Christian theology says person does not mean a human being. It means something like a distinct hypostasis or subsisting relation within the divine essence. But that's not actually an explanation of personhood, is it? It's simply a replacement definition created to preserve the doctrine. Once the ordinary meaning is removed, three persons no longer means three persons. It means three undefined distinctions within one alleged divine reality. Calling those distinctions persons make the doctrine sound more understandable than it is. Three distinct divine agents are three divine beings. Their agreement, shared purpose, shared nature, or perfect unity would not make them numerically one being any more than three perfectly united humans become one human being. Calling them one God would describe their group, class, or unity, not their numerical identity. That is what we call tritheism, regardless of whether Christians accept that label. And for those who didn't know, tritheism is the religious belief that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are three separate and distinct gods rather than three persons sharing one single divine essence. If each person is fully God, then the phrase the Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, and the Spirit is not the Father is just nonsensical. But it actually gets worse as we continue. Each person is fully God creates a direct identity problem. Consider the standard claims: the Father is God, the Son is God, the Father is not the Son. If is means identity, Father equals God, Son equals God, therefore Father equals Son. But the doctrine says the Father is not the Son. That's a contradiction. To avoid this, theologians change "is God" to mean something like possesses the divine nature. But then the Father possesses divinity, the Son possesses divinity, the Spirit possesses divinity. That gives three distinct possessors of the same type of nature, exactly what normally makes three beings of the same kind. A poker reference. Three people each fully possessing human nature are three humans. Three alleged persons each fully possessing divine nature would be three gods. The doctrine insists that divine nature behaves differently, but that's an assertion designed to block the conclusion, not an explanation of why the conclusion is wrong. Now, the Spirit makes the absurdity especially obvious. Calling Jesus a person at least makes sense when referring to the human Jesus. Calling the spirit a person has no comparable foundation. A spirit is not a man, woman, or child. The word may refer to breath, presence, power, influence, life, or an alleged immaterial entity. None of those is a person by definition. Christian theology personifies the spirit, interprets that personification as literal agency, and then calls that agency a separate person while simultaneously denying that it is a separate being. That's not a coherent classification. It's a doctrinal demand to treat the spirit as distinct enough to count as someone, but not as distinct enough to count as something separate. Now let's address the unavoidable trilemma, if you will. The Trinity has only three apparent options. The three are distinct persons in the ordinary sense, then they are three human beings, which Christianity denies. They are three distinct non human conscious agents, then there are three divine beings, three gods. They share one consciousness, will, and individual existence. Then they're not three persons, but three names, relations, or manifestations of one entity. Christian doctrine rejects all three conclusions while offering no coherent fourth category. So one being in three persons is not an explanation. Christian doctrine rejects all three conclusions while offering no coherent fourth category. So one being in three persons is not an explanation, it's the point at which the explanation breaks down. The phrase merely places oneness and threeness in different verbal categories and declares this prevents contradiction. One in being, three in person. But unless person names an intelligible kind of distinction that is neither a human being, an individual agent, nor a mode or relation, the formula has no coherent content. It's not profound because it exceeds understanding. It appears profound because its central terms are prevented from retaining stable meanings. The Trinity depends on technical language that prevents its central terms from retaining their ordinary meanings. Once person, being, is, and even numerical oneness are qualified differently from normal usage, the doctrine can be protected from direct contradiction, but at the cost of becoming unintelligible. This is where the doctrine stops sounding mysterious and starts sounding absurd. At Jesus' baptism, a voice from the heaven declares, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." One person is speaking about another person. The Father is expressing pleasure with someone other than himself. Jesus repeatedly prays to the Father. He asks the Father for help, submits his will to the Father's will, thanks the Father, and requests that the Father glorify him. While prayer is communication from one subject to another, it requires a speaker and an intended recipient. Then on the cross, Jesus cries, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But according to the Trinity, Jesus is God. So who exactly is forsaking whom? Myself. Why have I forsaken myself? That's what the statement becomes if the Father and Son are literally one individual being. God is appealing to God, asking God why God has abandoned God. If Christians respond that the Father and the Son are distinct enough for one to speak to, pray to, obey, love, glorify, and feel abandoned by the other, then they're describing two distinct conscious subjects, and two distinct divine subjects are two divine beings, regardless of how insistently theology calls them one. But if the Father and Son are not genuinely distinct subjects, then these scenes become divine theater. The doctrine requires the Father and Son to be separate whenever the biblical narrative needs a relationship between them, but one whenever monotheism needs to be protected. Now, for me, this conversation would feel petty if we didn't deal with the cognitive damage that we do to ourselves when we promote incoherence as logical. The damage of the Trinity is not limited to misunderstanding the nature of God. The deeper damage occurs when people are taught to abandon the basic rules of reasoning in order to preserve the doctrine, and then praise that abandonment as intellectual humility. When believers are conditioned to accept something incoherent as profound, that training has consequences. It teaches people that contradictions do not need to be resolved when authority declares them sacred. Instead of asking whether a claim makes sense, the believer learns to assume that the failure must be in their own understanding. You have to be too limited, too prideful, too human, or too spiritually immature to comprehend it. The person making the incoherent claim is no longer responsible for explaining it. Over time, this can teach people to distrust the very faculties they use to evaluate every other claim. Their ability to recognize contradiction becomes a spiritual liability. Their desire for clarity becomes arrogance. The refusal to repeat words they cannot meaningfully define becomes rebellion. The believer is trained to maintain two different standards of reasoning, one for ordinary life and another for protected religious claims. This is how incoherence gets normalized. The believer doesn't merely accept that they lack an answer, they're pressured to call the absence of an answer an answer. Three persons in one being is repeated as though it explains the problem when it merely restates it. There's an important difference between admitting that something is unknown and insisting that something unintelligible is known to be true. And when people get accustomed to suppressing their judgment for religious authority, the habit doesn't remain confined to theology. They can become more vulnerable to leaders, institutions, and systems that demand loyalty before comprehension. They may learn to accept contradictions from authority, reinterpret obvious failures as evidence of deeper wisdom, and blame themselves whenever reality refuses to match what they were told. The cognitive harm is that believers are taught to confuse complexity with contradiction and to treat confusion as evidence of profundity. A healthy intellectual response to an incoherent claim is not worship. It's recognizing when words do not form a meaningful explanation. Teaching people to deny that recognition does not strengthen their minds, it trains them to surrender them. So let's do a little deep dive. How does the idea of a trinity emerge? The idea of triune gods dates as far back as ancient Egypt, and I'm honestly surprised by the lack of conversation around this, because while Greco Roman mythology has triads as well, the Egyptian case is most closer in similarity. As a matter of fact, when papal Christianity is explored without bias, its early philosophies and even its current costumes and stylings share much more with pharaonic Egypt than most realize. Egypt had one in three gods long before Christianity. The Christian Trinity is often presented as an entirely unprecedented revelation, one God existing as three distinct persons. But more than 1,000 years before the doctrine was formally established, Egyptian theology had already developed several ways of describing divine plurality within divine unity. This wasn't limited to placing three gods together as a family. Egyptian religion also permitted gods to merge. A name could designate a particular dimension or expression of divinity. Because of this, divine names could be fused through what scholars called syncretism, creating composite gods that embrace the identities and powers of more than one deity. University College London specifically notes that this practice undermines the modern assumption that every divine name must represent a completely separate individual. That theological assumption made it possible for several recognizable divine identities to remain distinguishable while also being treated as one God. Ptah-Sokar-Osiris is one of the clearest examples. Ptah was a creator god and patron of craftsmen. Sokar was associated with the Memphite necropolis and the realm of death. Osiris was ruler of the underworld and the central god of resurrection and renewed life. Are you catching a theme here? These were not originally three names for the same god. They were identifiable deities with their own histories, functions, and cultic identities. Yet, Egyptian theology merged them into the single name deity, Ptah-Sokar-Osiris. The Metropolitan Museum of Art describes this new merged deity as a merging of three gods. The composite deity combined Ptah's creative power, Sokar's association with death and the necropolis, and Osiris's promise of regeneration. The museum's example dates back to approximately 750 to 700 before Common Era, more than 1,000 years before the Council of Nicaea. But there's also Amun-Re and Ptah, one God expressed through three. The Amun theology preserved in papyrus late in 1350 provides an even stronger comparison. The text dates to the Ramesside period in the 13th century before Common Era. Its famous formulation declares all gods are three, Amun, Re, and Ptah. It then distinguishes the three according to how the supreme God exists and appears. Amun is associated with the hidden identity of the God, Re with his visible manifestation or face, and Ptah with his body. The text is recognized in Egyptological scholarship as a sophisticated account of Amun's simultaneous transcendence and immanence. This is not simply a list of Egypt's three most important gods. The formulation gathers Amun, Re, and Ptah into one encompassing divine identity while preserving a distinct role for each. Amun is the hidden and unknowable divine reality, God the Father. Re is that divinity made visible, God the Son. Ptah is that divinity embodied and operative within creation, God the Spirit. The structure is therefore not merely three gods working together, it is one supreme divine reality understood through three distinguishable divine identities or manifestations. That predates the completed Christian doctrine of the Trinity by roughly 15 centuries. Now, the Egyptian and Christian systems are not identical, but the similarities are substantial. Both systems attempt to maintain oneness and threeness simultaneously. Both systems therefore resist the ordinary conclusion that three distinguishable divine identities must equal three completely separate gods. Both preserve distinction without allowing distinction to destroy unity. Both preserve unity without completely dissolving the three identities into interchangeable names. Both also associate the threefold structure with different ways the divine becomes known or active. And the similarities extend beyond the number three. In both cases, theology refuses the normal counting rule. The components are distinct enough to be named and assigned different functions, but their distinction is not permitted to make them separate gods. So Christianity didn't invent the concept of three indistinguishable divine identities united within one encompassing God. Egyptian theology had already developed that pattern more than a millennium earlier. Ptah-Sokar-Osiris demonstrates the formal merger of three established gods into one composite deity. Amun-Re-Ptah demonstrates an even more sophisticated threefold account of one supreme divine reality as hidden, visible, and embodied. The Egyptian system supplies a significant conceptual precedent, not merely a coincidental fascination with the number three. Okay, so now let's talk about before the Trinity became superstition. I warn you, this is going to be a zig when you expect it a zag. Because the more useful question is not merely who had a Trinity first, it's actually what problem these threefold systems were originally attempting to solve before Christianity usurped this idea and concretized it in superstition. The threefold structures found in Egypt and Greco Roman thought may not have begun as claims about three invisible supernatural persons having relationships with one another. They appear more fundamentally to have been attempts to explain how reality can be one interconnected whole while appearing through different dimensions. Ancient thinkers were confronting questions that remain recognizable. How does an invisible source produce a visible world? Why does the universe possess order rather than just chaos? What causes matter to move, develop, live, and change? How can reality be one while containing countless distinct things? The recurring answer of the ancients was that reality could be understood through three inseparable dimensions: what reality fundamentally is, the rational structure by which it becomes intelligible, and the power or activity through which it becomes manifest. Different cultures gave these dimensions different names. Sometimes they were presented as gods, sometimes divine powers, and sometimes as metaphysical principles. But the underlying concern was often less about counting supernatural personalities and more about mapping the structure of existence as perceived and experienced. Now, this doesn't require imagining three invisible persons living inside one supernatural being. It can function as symbolic language for three aspects of the same reality: the hidden source, its visible expression, and its material embodiment. The Egyptians placed faces and names upon these dimensions because gods were their cultural vocabulary for discussing the forces and patterns of existence. But behind the mythology was a genuine philosophical problem. How does the unseen become seen, and how does the formless become formed? Greek philosophy translated divine stories into metaphysics. Greek philosophers increasingly attempted to explain similar problems through abstract principles rather than traditional myth alone. They asked how the many could emerge from the one, how an intelligible order could govern matter, and how an unchanging foundation could produce a changing world. In Stoicism, the universe was explained through an active and passive principle. Passive matter supplied the material, while the active divine principle, identified with reason, logos, and pneuma, structured, animated, and sustained it. Pneuma was understood as the force that held physical things together, and at increasingly complex levels produced growth, animal life, and rational thought. Logos was not originally Jesus. Pneuma was not originally a third divine person. There were ways of describing what the universe visibly does. Their version of God was closely identified with the active rational structure permeating the physical cosmos, not necessarily an immaterial person standing outside it. Christianity turned explanatory principles into supernatural persons. What earlier systems could treat as dimensions, forces, manifestations, or stages of reality became three alleged conscious subjects who spoke, loved, sent, obeyed, glorified, and interacted with one another. The problem is that Christianity retained the earlier claim that the three were expressions of one ultimate reality while simultaneously transforming them into persons. That's where the incoherence becomes unavoidable. Reason, activity, and existence can be absolutely three distinguishable concepts within one reality. A source, its expression, and its effect can belong to one process. The sun, its light, and its heat can be distinguished without becoming three persons. But once those distinctions are treated as individual subjects, an I, a you, and another he, their unity can no longer be explained simply by saying they belong to one underlying reality. Christianity personified the categories but refused to accept the plurality that personification creates. The Father became distinct enough to speak about the Son. The Son became distinct enough to pray to the Father. The Spirit became distinct enough to be sent by them, yet Christianity still insisted that these were not separate beings. The doctrine therefore preserved an older threefold metaphysical structure while changing what its components were. What may once have functioned as a symbolic map of reality became a mandatory belief about three invisible persons occupying one God. This is how we move from metaphor to dogma. Ancient Egyptians did not necessarily need Ptah-Sokar-Osiris to satisfy modern logic. Their divine composites functioned within a fluid symbolic system. A god could merge with another god because both represented overlapping dimensions of nature, society, death, creation, or cosmic order. Greek philosophers could debate whether intellect proceeded from the one or whether pneuma organized matter because these were philosophical models. Their concepts could be challenged, revised, or even replaced. Christianity did something different altogether. It historicized the Logos as Jesus, personalized the Spirit, declared all three fully divine, and then enforced their unity and distinction as revealed truth. An evolving attempt to explain reality became a supernatural proposition that believers were required to affirm even when its terms cease to make any coherent sense. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me for today's video. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And if you're looking for community where you can deconstruct harmful beliefs while reconstructing healthy ways of connecting with others and information, I invite you to join Bridge City. We have weekly community programming like our Sunday sessions and our Wednesday lives. And we've developed several points of engagement like our house parties, our coffee hours, our movie nights, and we even have game nights, including tabletop role-playing games. We also have clubs, groups, and teams that you can get involved with to explore your interests, share your talents, and grow stronger as individuals and as a community. So the big question is, what are you waiting on? Join our community today and make sure you introduce yourself so that we can welcome you into our virtual neighborhood. The link is in the description below, and the QR code is on the screen. That's all I have for now. Until next time, keep rising.